The Alaska Salmon Run, one of the most important times of the year for all who rely on this keystone species. Salmon sit at the center of a myriad of social, cultural, and spiritual practices, norms, and values intrinsic to the health and well-being in Alaska. Many communities in Alaska are intimately tied to salmon fisheries for their livelihoods. Commercial fishing in Alaska is a vital source of income statewide, providing $1.3 billion annually, and employs more workers than any other industry in Alaska. On a national level, Alaska provides nearly 50% of the United States' wild landings and creates over $5.8 billion in direct and indirect economic outputs. Salmon are an integral component of a worldwide ecological, economic, and cultural network, yet climate change and mismanagement threaten the sustainability of salmon and other major fisheries for generations to come. Changes in global climate are contributing to trends in marine ecosystems, such as warming and ocean acidification, that pose significant threats to the viability of many of the world's fisheries and fisheries-dependent societies. Persistent environmental fluctuations, or regime shifts, are having a pronounced effect on Alaskan salmon as well as a variety of other North Pacific fish species, including dramatic body size declines influencing demography and trophic interactions that may reduce the sustainable delivery of ecosystem services such as fisheries yield. Smaller salmon could threaten food security in rural salmon-dependent communities, where diminished access to calorie-rich salmon directly influences well-being and human health. In fact, according to a 2018 study conducted by the National Institutes of Health, 14% of the overall Alaskan population experiences food insecurity, in which 19% of that number is comprised of the Alaska Native population. From an economic perspective, smaller salmon translate to lost commercial fisheries profit due to reduced flesh recovery rates, increased processing costs, and lower prices. Maintenance of body size in addition to abundance is critical for maintaining healthy salmon people and salmon ecosystem relationships. It's imperative, however, to not use climate as a scapegoat for issues primarily induced by human mismanagement of fisheries. In most regards, Alaska, especially Southeast Alaska, is a pioneer in sustainable fisheries, yet there are still areas that require greater attention and improvement. Forecasts of future returning stocks of salmon are an important planning tool for processors, fishermen, and managers, but they are often unreliable and use mechanisms that are poorly understood. The politics that go into fisheries conservation can also be highly polarizing and are often too much talk and not enough action.
Our system of management in the United States is just not very nimble. And part of that is because NEPA requires a very careful, researched, scientifically rigorous process with a lot of public input, and that's all great. But when systems change so quickly, there has to be an ability of management to pick it up and keep up with that change. And that's what we're really struggling with right now, both through reauthorization of the Magnuson Act and with our own, management council here of you've got these committees working on, like an ecosystem committee and a climate change task force, but what is the mechanism for that information to influence management, and how are you going to move fast enough to keep up with these changes?
We've done all kinds of things to protect our local resources, but that takes collaboration and cooperation. And right now, the overall prevailing attitude of hostility and confrontation and not working together and rejecting science and the scientific findings if you don't agree with them, it makes it really more difficult to solve our mutual problems that are going on.
And while an important aspect of sustainability is conserving the health and abundance of wildlife populations, the health and livelihoods of the people that rely on them needs to be equally accounted for. In response to depleted fish stocks in recent history, a limited entry-based fisheries management strategy was introduced. However, individual fishing quotas, or IFQs, have severely reduced access for many rural and native Alaskans that already struggle with food insecurity. Key limitations, especially for small communities, are access to capital to purchase fishing rights and permits, and to develop the capacity for processing seafood products, and physical access to a wide array of fishing resources. Resource access is the prerequisite to being able to achieve one's well-being in the context of Alaska's salmon systems. Yet, dimensions of well-being remain unaccounted for in dominant approaches to measuring quality of life and managing natural resources.
So in Southeast Alaska, they have they call them an IFQ, right? An individual fishing quota, where the quota for the fish that you're gonna go catch has to be in a specific person's name. Um, Up north, they don't have that, and you have a quota, but these quotas can be bought out by corporations and companies. And once it starts going to the companies and corporations, they kind of are only thinking about the bottom line.
We've seen a huge exodus of permits, state limited entry permits, and federal quota from rural and particularly indigenous communities. When they lose the commercial platforms to harvest fish from, it also reduces their ability to conduct subsistence harvest.
Even young fishermen, like Alex, the future generation necessary for supplying fish to much of the world, are struggling or even debating whether the investment is worth it. Many of these communities have suffered an 84% decline in the number of young salmon fishermen.
Quite frankly, we really screwed up in Alaska. We did not build the mechanisms in for the crews and the things in either our IFQ programs or a limited entry program. And it's become prohibitive for people to enter the fisheries. Unless you have family or independently wealthy or stuff, it's gonna be really, really hard for you to afford the capital investment in permits and boats and gear and equipment to compete.
Getting into these fisheries is so expensive, and you can easily be in it, a couple $1 million to have your permits and your boat and everything like that. And if you did that as someone relatively starting out, a lot of these younger guys starting out, people starting out, it's a big investment to kind of be concerned about the future with. Is it worth it to invest in your life in something like that when you don't know what's going to happen?
So how can we improve? Evidently, fisheries are highly variable, fluctuating strongly at interannual and interdecadal timescales that have major economic consequences for the communities that rely on them. Change is inevitable. The viability of Alaska's salmon fisheries, however, depend on how we react and adapt to these changes. Our ability to predict the timing and character of changes will always be limited, and so we need to develop strategies that are robust to uncertainty. Over 85% of fishing communities saw large decreases in revenue following major regime shifts. However, communities with the highest portfolio diversity and those that could opportunistically shift the composition of resources they harvest experienced negligible or even positive changes in revenue. Granted, such diversification will require large capital input, furthering the inequities already present among many Alaskans. Rather, management strategies need to be developed that takes well-being indicators into account instead of approaching humans as simplistic constructions of individualized, profit-maximizing actors. The health of Alaska's salmon fisheries depends on building upon its conservation-oriented management policy by emphasizing ecosystem-based strategies and cross-resource solutions that takes into account traditional place-based and communal ways of life.
If you want durable conservation, you do have to listen to local voices and enlist local wisdom to figure out how to do that in a way that respects local economies and respects those cultures and incorporates them into the conservation of the resource in a way that's sustainable for the whole system.
Part of the solution will require our ability to govern and allocate a portfolio of food resources in an adaptive and regionally tailored fashion, much in the way many indigenous societies adapt culturally to environmental variability and change through flexible subsistence calendars that incorporate multiple primary and secondary food options. Only approaches in which food sovereignty and biological diversity are mutually assured can thriving and vibrant natural resource-dependent communities exist.
People harvesting fish to eat is the highest importance after conservation and sustainability. Fish that are going to local people to eat are the highest priority when there's shortages or anything. Having these resources sustained for local people to eat is critical to the future of rural communities across Alaska.
Such change is required in not just Alaska, but the entire world. A large proportion of the world's population lives in coastal communities and is critically dependent on marine resources. Thus, the future of every fishery requires an abrupt paradigm shift in which adaptive ecosystem and place-based management practices that prioritize food sovereignty are implemented. Our very lives depend on it.